Hey quilters, it's Patti Carey of Patti's Patchwork. Thank you for joining the For the Brave Quilt-Along event, celebrating the 10th anniversary of Northcott's iconic Stonehenge Stars and Stripes. I'm so glad you're here. Together, we're going to make this stunning Quilts of Valor sized quilt. Each month, I will share with you my tips and tricks to help you get your blocks done efficiently, accurately, and successfully. Let's get started with block 1. Here's what you'll need to get started. A copy of the For the Brave quilt pattern. You can purchase it from your local quilt shop or from Patti's Patchwork. You'll also need fabrics A, B, C, D, and E. In the pattern, the yardage is listed for best use of fabric, so you'll want to cut all of the pieces from these fabrics and label them as indicated. Then we'll just use the pieces that are required for block 1 and set the others aside. For block 1, we're going to start with the corner units. We have 2 at a time half square triangles to sew. We're going to sew an E8 to each D4. I've marked a diagonal line on the back of my E8 pieces, and I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch each side of the line. Because I have 2 of these, I am going to chain piece, stitching down one side of the line on both pieces. Then I turn it around and stitch down the other side. This is fast and easy. Next, we trim by cutting along that line. Our stitching line is accurate, so our cutting line does not need to be exactly along the line. I then finger press my seam toward D. I like to use a hair marker to do my finger pressing. I also like to trim my tips as I go. It helps reduce bulk in my blocks. Next, we're going to sew an E7 to each D3, sewing diagonally along the line. I have marked my line with a hair marker. Typically we sew from the corner, but I find it easier to sew from the midpoint, preventing my fabric from getting sucked down the whole of my sewing plate. We have 4 of these, so we're going to sew all 4. I am stitching 1 needle width to the left of that line. This is the equivalent of sewing a scant 1/4 inch, and it allows my patches to be perfectly aligned when I'm finished. I am going to finger press my seams toward D3. See how nicely those are aligned because I've stitched 1 needle width or a thread width to the left of my line. Now I will trim off the excess fabric 1/4 inch beyond my sewing line. We set these units aside for now. And we sew our remaining E7s to the half square triangles. I also like to use my hair marker as a stiletto because it is a little bulky at the beginning. We are going to chain piece these 4 units together. One more. We're going to finger press these toward fabric D. This may be counterintuitive, but I'm already planning my quilting, and if I decide to custom quilt, I want to stitch in the ditch in my background. Now we sew the left half to the right half. I am sewing with the D3 section on top. There are 3 seams along this line of stitching, and I find that 2 of them, the seams are running toward me if I sew with D3 on top. It helps me manage the seams so that I don't inadvertently get one that is flipped the wrong way. I align the patches at the top and bottom so that my unit will be perfectly square. Again, I am going to finger press toward fabric D. Our corner units are now done. We can move on to the side units. We have more 2 at a time half square triangles, this time with C6 and E8. Of course, we're going to chain piece down one side of all 4 of these units. And then we flip it around and chain piece down the other side. Cut along that line. And then we'll press our seams toward fabric C. We have 4 left-facing and 4 right-facing corners on these side sections. I am dividing my E9 and C7 pieces into 2 piles of 4. Here we are going to refer to the tip that's at the top of page 3. When we have a square meeting a triangle, we sew them together, aligning the triangle extending 3/8 of an inch beyond. When we have a triangle meets a triangle, they cross at the 1/4 inch seam line. We align these 2 patches so that the top square edges are perfectly aligned, and we can see that our bottom triangle extends 3/8 of an inch below the bottom edge of our half square triangle unit. That is the correct placement. Our last 1 or 2 stitches will be on the triangle only. When we sew the unit this way, we do not lose our tips in our seam allowance. Chain piece these 4 units together. And then finger press toward fabric C. Then we add our C7 to the bottom edge. This time, when we align the top 2 square corners, we find that our 2 angled seams, 2 angled edges meet a 1/4 of an inch from the right edge. Our stitching line will end right at that V where those 2 pieces cross. Make sure that seam does not flip back. And make that stitching line end right where those 2 triangles meet. We finger press our seam toward fabric C. Where that intersection is exactly on the 1/4 inch seam line. Now we repeat the process with the other side to make the mirror image units for the other corner. Again, we will have 3/8 of an inch of our background triangle beyond the bottom edge of our half square triangle unit. We finger press the seams towards C. And then add the remaining C7 units, having them cross exactly 1/4 of an inch from the right edge of our patches. Finger press the seam toward fabric C and trim our tips if we wish. Now it's time to add the B1 triangles. We start with one side, matching the outer tip of our B1 triangle with the outer tip of our corner unit. At the bottom edge, our background triangle will extend 3/8 of an inch beyond the squared bottom edge of our B1 triangle. Keep those right edges aligned. And we chain piece all 4 units. We finger press our seams toward fabric B. Now it's time to add the other side. Align the outer tip of B1 with the outer tip of our corner unit and have them cross exactly 1/4 of an inch from the right edge. This will prevent us from losing the tip of our B triangle in the seam allowance. We can also sew this unit starting with that bottom corner edge of B1. So have the pieces cross 1/4 of an inch from the edge and then match those 2 triangle tips. I like sewing it this way because it enables me to check and see that I am sewing and having my seam line cross exactly at the seam line of my corner unit. One last unit to go. Again, we finger press our seam toward B. Now it's time to assemble our blocks. If we have directional prints, check that the direction of the fabrics is going all in the same direction as our center A square. Add our corner units, and then it's time to assemble the block. I am going to sew the second unit in row 1 to the first unit in row 1, and then chain piece the second unit in row 2 to the first unit in row 2, and so on. This helps me keep my block pieces correctly aligned and makes it so much faster and more efficient. Now I am chain piecing the second piece in row 2 to the first unit in row 2. And finally, the second unit in row 3 to the first unit in row 3. All 3 rows are still attached by the chain between rows. Now I add the third unit in each row to the second unit. I'm sewing the third unit in row 1 to the second unit in row 1. Then I'll chain piece the third unit in row 2 to the second unit in row 2, still keeping them attached by the chain of thread. And finally add the third unit in row 3 to the second unit in row 3. Now it's time to sew the rows together. I finger press my seams toward the center and the corner units toward the corners. We sew the last 2 rows by sewing row 1 to row 2. I want to nest my seams where my center A square meets the corner units. You can feel if the seams are properly nested. Ease in any fullness as required. And make those patches line up at the beginning and the end of each seam so that your block will be nice and square. One last seam to sew, sewing the third row to the second row. Nesting the seam where the center A square meets the corner unit. And make the patches line up at the beginning and the end of each seam. Finally, I am going to spin my seams. My center seam is going to the left, my top seam is going to the right, so I want the left seam to go up and the right seam to go down. I do this by unpicking the stitches in the seam allowance only on both seams, and it will enable me to spin that seam to reduce the bulk. This is diagrammed at the top of page 4. Now I press my A seams toward top and bottom edges, and I press the corner seams toward the center. Our block is done. And there you have block 1. Make sure to head on over to the Northcott Instagram page to enter for the first block giveaway. This is open to US and Canadian residents. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you back here next month for block 2.